Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast that goes beyond aircraft and operations to explore the people, decisions, and lesser-known stories behind the air war of the Second World War. I'm Jane Gulliford-Lowes, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by my co-host, James Jeffries. James, it's lovely to have you with us again. How have you been since last week?
I'm good, yeah. It's still PhD, which is taking over my life now. That seems to be everything. But looking after myself. I'm very happy, doing a lot of fitness. And when I'm not doing PhD work, I'm into nature at the moment. So I'm out in the garden doing work. I recently read Life on Earth by David Attenborough, which is very far away from Bomber Command, but it was a good little break. Also, I've been prepping for the World War II course. I think I mentioned it in the last pod. I could never remember what I said in the last pod. So coming up with the syllabus for that and picking the class trips. So that'll be the usual trip to Duxford and Imperial War Museum London and such like. We're working at Wolverhampton still, a strategic bombing course, which has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed the student discussions there. There's been some really, really good, good viewpoints and very, very interesting to read through that. But how are you, Jane?
I'm good, thank you. Very busy. I'm rather chipper this evening because, as I've said, tomorrow is my non-working Friday. By the time this episode goes out next week, I will be just about to depart to Norway for a considerable length of time. So very, very happy about that. So before we get on to today's episode, then it feels quite significant to say that this is the final episode of Series 4. And it's actually 2 years to the day since Never Mind the Dam Busters was created.
Is it?
That, yeah, and announced to the world, yeah. Considering we only ever intended doing 6 episodes to see how it went, Here we are on episode 71. So this series, Series 4, I think has been fantastic, and we've covered such a wide range of topics, from aircraft and operations to some really sort of thought-provoking discussions about people and ethics and all sorts of different stuff. What have your highlights been of this series so far, James?
Well, obviously, I missed a little bit at the start because I was ill, so it's been lovely to come back. And we had some great ones that I missed. So I love the fact that we kicked off talking about the Canadians, vital part of Bomber Command and the Second World War. Always there to give a shout out to the Canadians and their effort. Episodes on the Short Sterling and Mozzie were brilliant. I'm gutted that I missed that, especially the Short Sterling one, actually. And I know viewers were keen on that as well. They really wanted a Sterling episode. Also gutted to have missed Alan Allport. I always find him incredibly interesting to listen to. And I have to say, actually, I can't remember if I said this before, he did spell my name wrong in the acknowledgements, but I'll take the acknowledgement. It's Jeffries, but it was lovely to be acknowledged. If that wasn't me, of course, it could be a James Jeffries with a different spelling, I don't know. But yeah, when I came back, I really enjoyed Matt Doncaster's episode. That was fun. And that's one that, when he was talking, the energy and enthusiasm, it was like a brilliant science teacher at school where you just thought, go, tell me more. Oh my God, how does this work? And he was waving his hands about and stuff. So fantastic guests. I love animated guests, when they really get into it. Eric's as well, I enjoyed, but you couldn't miss because he's talking about Bristol Blenheims, which as ever is always going to perk me up and get my interest. And I mean, finally, the Q&As have been tremendous fun. I've always enjoyed those. We always get brilliant questions. We've got a whole pile more, Jane, I think, haven't we, in the background for more next series. So, and keep coming in, people, please. We love them. I'm going to pick my favourite, and it might be a surprise.
Go on.
Cold War bombers.
Ah, with Joe.
With Joe. And I want a bit more of that. Talk about Vulcans and everything. It was fascinating, and it's something that I would like us to explore a little bit because, we say Bomber Command wasn't just the Dam Busters, it wasn't just the Second World War either. And it would be fascinating to look at the V-Force and what was going on, post-war and such like.
Yeah.
But how about you, Jane? What are some of your favourites?
It's really tough. I think what stood out was the breadth of perspectives we've been able to bring in. We have had some outstanding guests. I mean, every single one of them has been brilliant. It's really hard to pick a favourite episode, but I absolutely loved the Short Sterling one that you just mentioned with Jonathan Faulkner. And Also, the bomb aiming one with Matt Doncaster, that really appealed to the massive nerd in me. I absolutely love that. It's been fascinating to explore not just the operational side of the air war, but the sort of the lesser known and more nuanced stories that don't always make it into the mainstream narrative. And I think in particular that the episode that stands out for me there is the one we did with Thomas Rost on bomb disposal in Hamburg. I know that we've had a lot of really good feedback on that one because it's something that just doesn't really get talked about. So anyway, today's episode very much falls into that category, stuff that doesn't usually get talked about.
Because when we think about aircrew in the Second World War, we often imagine very definitive outcomes. Either they make it back to base, although obviously some did and they were wounded. Others missing in action, killed in action. The figure 55,573 out of 125,000, one part of the stat. Or perhaps they became prisoners of war, which is roughly about 10,000, which is no small figure as well, by the Axis forces. And this latter category is, well, it's not as simple as it first appears, is it, Jane?
No, we're focusing on today the internment of Allied airmen in neutral countries. This is not something that I'd ever really thought about before, I must confess. So what happened when crews came down in places that weren't at war? How were they treated and what did neutrality really mean in practice? So to help us explore all of that, I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Andrew White. Andrew is a retired RAF intelligence officer who served from 1985 to 2011, including operational tours in Northern Ireland, Bosnia and Iraq. He now works as a battlefield guide and military historian and is the author of 3 published biographies of airmen from both world wars. Andrew, a very warm welcome to Nevermind the Dambusters. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, Jane. Hi, James. And thank you very much for inviting me along.
Now, we need to sort of set the context before we get into this conversation. And before we get into specific countries and experiences, let's start with the fundamentals. So, Andrew, what exactly was internment during the Second World War and how was it governed under international law? What were neutral countries required to do when military personnel from warring nations pitched upon their territory, basically?
Yeah, all good questions. So internment is captivity. However, it's not captivity as you would experience as a prisoner of war. First and foremost, you're not being held captive by your enemies. You're being held in a neutral country that has no axe to grind with you. You're not at war with them. So therefore, you would hope that your treatment is going to be better than it would be if you were held prisoner by the Axis. But that wasn't always the case, as we can come on to later. I looked at 3 definitions of neutrality, one by the Red Cross, one by the United Nations, and one by an academic, and they all include the word impartiality in war. So, in theory, a neutral nation should be impartial. It shouldn't favour one belligerent over the other. But in reality, I don't think a neutral country can ever achieve full impartiality, and they certainly didn't in the Second World War. A neutral country is not just taking in our aircrew. Let's take the case of Sweden, for example. They're also taking in German aircrew as well, as did the Irish, and they have to treat them exactly the same because you are supposed to be impartial. But that, as I say, that wasn't always the case. So internment is captivity, but it's on a more hopefully benign basis than you would expect to suffer under being imprisoned as a POW by your enemies. In terms of international law, at the start of the Second World War, frankly, internment was a bit of a mess. The treatment of POWs was governed, of course, by the Geneva Convention, but the Geneva Convention did not cover the treatment of internees. The document that did cover their treatment was called Hague 5. So the Hague Resolution number 5, which bizarrely was signed and ratified in 1910. So even before the First World War, way before anybody had ever thought about aerial combat. So it doesn't have any specifics in it about how you treat aircrew that have come down in your country. And the whole legislation was open to interpretation. For example, it says that neutral countries may imprison internees in a fortress, for example, or any other place it feels fit. So It's saying that you have to intern people, but you don't actually have to imprison them.
Right.
So there is a good deal of interpretation applied to that law. And hopefully we'll draw out as we talk more. The countries that I looked at really did apply their own interpretation to Hague 5 and really kind of did what they felt was right because the law was so utterly vague. I mean, if I just give you an example of how vague it was, during the First World War, a German airship, the L-70, came down just off Norway, which was neutral during the First World War. And some of the crew were rescued from inside Norwegian territorial waters by a Norwegian boat. Some of them were rescued outside of territorial waters by a Norwegian boat. So they thought, well, what do we do with them? We picked some of them up outside of our territorial borders. So they were allowed to go home. But those who were picked up inside Norwegian waters were interned for the duration. So there was no clear legislation on what should have happened to those people. And it just had not sorted itself out by the start of the Second World War.
This reminds me of going off script. A 10-minute film that was an Irish production called The German, which dealt with this. I imagine you've probably seen it online. Yeah. I don't know if you have, Jane. Yeah, that sprung to mind. But anyway, to stick to the script, the next question really is, well, which neutral nations ended up holding British and Allied airmen in internment camps during the war?
Yeah, I mean, there were several neutral countries during the war, obviously, so I concentrated on those who had just held British aircrew in internment. So I guess there are the ones that immediately spring to mind for people. You have Sweden, you have Switzerland, but there was also Spain and Portugal, Ireland as well, and Turkey. And also the one that is kind of the rotten apple, I suppose, is Vichy France. But we'll talk a little bit more about that probably. And also, before Hitler attacks into the West on the 10th of May 1940, you had Belgium and Luxembourg and Iceland, who all held British aircrew until their neutrality was violated by Blitzkrieg in May 40.
So can you tell us a little about how British airmen were treated while interned, Andrew? And was their experience broadly similar to that of prisoners of war, or was it something quite altogether different?
It's a bit of both, really, because there was this vagueness in international law. Then, as I said, neutral countries tended to put their own twist on it and treat them as they saw fit. You can broadly split the countries that I've just spoken about up into three groups. There are those who treated our guys as guests. There are those who treated them as an inconvenience. And there are those who treated them as prisoners of war. And it really depended on your fate as to where you came down, as to how you were going to be treated. So for those nations that were treated them as guests, you could really lump together Sweden, Switzerland, and Ireland, and also Turkey as well. Our guys arrived there. You could come down in a neutral country for several different reasons. Navigational error was a major one, particularly in Ireland, because of that weather over the English Channel and St George's approaches. But of course, you would more likely come down in occupied or in Sweden, Switzerland, because of battle damage on the aircraft. You're losing fuel. The aircraft is still flying, but rather than bail out over occupied Europe or Germany, then you choose to go to either Switzerland or Sweden, for example. So in those countries, yes, they were really treated as guests. In Switzerland and Sweden, for example, they held British aircrew in internment, not in camps, but they put them up in local hotels. And they were also farmed out to family-owned pensions and places like that. And they were given a fair degree of latitude. All of the countries that I looked at operated a system of parole, which you may be familiar with. Parole was a gentleman's word and bond that, if we let you out for a certain amount of time, we must promise not to escape. So the guys did this. And in Sweden, in Switzerland, they went off skiing. They went ice skating as well, to the cinemas. They went to local dances. They hooked up with the local female population. And actually, many of them got jobs as English language teachers in local schools. And then in the case of Ireland, arguably they had the laxest or the most lax system of parole. You were basically allowed to go wherever you wanted to, as long as you promised to come back. There was a case of one RAF flying officer who played so much golf in Ireland that he wrote to his father saying, I expect to be the British Open golf champion in 1943. And also in Ireland, you were allowed to go down the pub, which of
Marvellous.
course, they were obviously going to do. The only problem is that neutrality is impartiality. And the Irish are also holding German aircrew and U-boat crews and things like that. They're also allowed to go down the pub. So as you're signing your parole on the exit, you're told, look, don't go down the Black Lion tonight because the Germans are going in there. Or if you do, just make sure you stay in the bar because they'll be in the lounge. And there were several cases of punch-ups between the two factions as well because of this very lax system of parole that the Irish ran. So those are the groups really that would consider, or the countries that considered the internees as guests. Then you have those who consider them just as a complete pain, as an inconvenience. And we can really narrow that down to Spain and Portugal. They just didn't want them there at all. They didn't understand the legislation. It was all too difficult. And they sent them home as quickly as they could. Under the Hague rules, you were not supposed to send people home as a new country. They were supposed to be held captive for the duration, but they didn't. And in Spain's case, certainly, and which seems kind of strange considering their Axis leanings, the Spanish authorities actually facilitated the so-called escape of many of our guys. They were actually driven to the border of Gibraltar by the Spanish police and handed over to an RAF flight lieutenant on the border who took them into Gib, and then they were sent home. Portugal, guys were home in less than a month throughout the war. They were just not wanted there. They were treated very well. They were put up in hotels, parole, etc. But as soon as they could be put on a Portuguese freighter to Liverpool, then they were just sent back. And then we come down to kind of the last group of people who treated them as prisoners. And that is really just one country, perhaps unsurprisingly, Vichy France. We had a very strained relationship with Vichy, particularly after sinking their fleet at Mers El Kabir. And after that point, British aircrew who came down in either Vichy mainland France or in French-held North Africa were really treated very, very badly. The conditions in the Vichy internment camps were horrific. They were far worse than you would expect to find in Sargon or Politz or wherever. And particularly in North Africa, one of the guys' accounts I read said that survival was problematic. There was dysentery, there was a lack of water, a lack of hygiene, the food was disgusting. And of course, being in North Africa, most of the camps were in the Sahara. They were former Foreign Legion camps, so you've got the weather to deal with as well. And the Vichy French were certainly not averse in handing out beatings as punishment and treating them very, very badly indeed. So yeah, it really depended on your luck as to what your fate would be as an internee.
Gosh, this is absolutely fascinating.
Isn't it just? Yeah.
Especially the bit about the pub. Don't go down that end. That's where the Germans... It's almost Dad's Army-esque, isn't it? That's where the Germans go.
I know.
But yeah, the next question really is, you mentioned the politics of Spain, fascist, etc. So to what extent did the treatment of interned airmen depend on the neutral country's political position or its relationship with Britain and Germany as well?
Well, I think their treatment was 100% linked with the neutrals' relations with the warring factions, either us or the Axis. So, yeah, as you might expect, let's choose Spain as an example. In the early days of the war, Spain was routinely sending downed German aircrew back to Spain, but would hang on to ours. So then there was a diplomatic argument about this. British complained bitterly, and the Spanish eventually gave in and started sending our guys back as well. But certainly their repatriation policy was very, very pro-Axis to start off with, as it was with Switzerland. And you've got to look at Switzerland's geography, really, for that. After 1940, they were surrounded by the Axis, by Italy and Germany. And they really didn't want to upset either of them. So they started sending German internees back. And again, we complain about that. And eventually they start sending British guys back as well. So, yeah, certainly in their cases, they were very, very pro-Axis. But then again, if we take the example of Ireland, they were very pro-Allied. They share a land border with Great Britain, and they've been part of Great Britain up until the 1920s. And also, of course, there's a large Irish population in America. So they really didn't want to upset the Americans as well. So the Irish came up with a fantastic way of dealing with internees and the question of repatriation. In the very early days of the war, so 1939, several RAF flying boats came down in Irish territorial waters, and with engine problems and things like that. And there's one lovely case where an Irish mechanic rowed out to the Sunderland and fixed the engine for it, and then they were able to fly back off to the UK mainland. That all stopped after the Irish interned the crew of a Popple Condor. They then said, well, okay, if we're interning the Germans, we really ought to intern the Brits as well. But then it came to the question of repatriation, and the Irish, if I can get this right, the Irish said, if an aircraft of whatever nation was on an offensive sortie, then the crew will be interned. If they're on a training mission or a non-offensive sortie, then they can be repatriated. Our stance is that all German aircraft are considered to be on an offensive sortie unless they can prove any different. All British aircraft are assumed to be on a non-operational sortie unless we prove any different. So it was a very, very one-sided and blatantly pro-Allied internment and repatriation policy that the Irish had. So, yeah, whichever country you were, it really depended on that neutral country's relations with us or the Axis as to how the internees were treated. And this really explains perhaps part of why they were so badly treated by the Vichy French. Vichy is a puppet of Nazi Germany. The Nazis aren't going to allow the French to treat them any different than a prisoner of war. But I think it's fair to say that as the war goes on, certainly post-1943, after Stalingrad, after Operation Torch, etc., in North Africa, the war starts to go against the Germans. And pretty much all of the neutral countries' favours began to swing more towards the Allies than the Germans. And just to give you an example of that, in the case of Sweden, the Swedes were very, very even-handed about repatriation. They would repatriate 50 of our guys for 50 Germans. Because as the war goes on, more and more Brits and American aircrew are arriving in Sweden because of the combined bomber offensive, and fewer Germans are arriving. So the Swedes said, right, we're going to carry on repatriating Brits and Americans, Germany, and should we ever get any more of yours, we'll send them home as well. But of course, they never did. They were just sending hundreds of British and Americans back, but with no Germans to send in the other direction, just a promise that they would do if they ever got them.
Andrew, you just briefly touched on the treatment of interned airmen as the war progressed. So did their treatment actually change then as the war progressed and as the balance of power shifted?
Yes, it did. I mean, you have those nations anyway that are treating them as guests. So in terms of parole and living conditions and, going skiing or off down the local dance or whatever, that didn't really change. But certainly in Sweden's case, when the British aircrew were on parole, prior to D-Day, they were always escorted by a Swedish military police escort. But after D-Day, that just disappeared. They were allowed to come and go as they pleased. So, parole was really almost literally an open door to them. In terms of Vichy France, it was Operation Torch that finished internment there. They never repatriated anybody, but the Americans invade and they arrive and sort of liberate our guys, if you like, from internment. And they were all sent home from there. But the Vichy French never really changed their attitude towards our internees. But then again, Vichy France essentially collapses before the war turns against Germany anyway. Certainly in the case of Ireland, yes, they were already pro-Allied. But again, as the war progresses, they become even more pro-Allied. And again, after D-Day, almost all British internees were returned. They managed to hang on to 11 guys who the Irish said, well, actually, you were on an offensive sortie, so you're staying here. But again, post D-Day, it was pretty obvious which way the war was going, and they let them go as well. So yes, the fortunes of war very definitely did change neutral countries' attitudes towards Britain.
Therefore, I mean, were interned airmen typically held for the duration of the war? I mean, you mentioned some examples there of repatriation, but I wondered if you wanted to talk about some other opportunities that might have come along as well.
Yeah, I mean, repatriation is it's an interesting situation, really, because perhaps as I mentioned, the international law gave no provision for repatriation at all. They were supposed to be interned for the duration. The only people who could be repatriated were those who were so badly injured that they couldn't take any further part in the war. And the same condition went for POWs as well. If you were so badly injured you couldn't take any further part, then you could go home. And repatriation also applied to padres and medics as well. So there was no provision for internees to go home. And yet, every single neutral nation that held British aircrew, bar Vichy France, regularly repatriated aircrew. And again, this comes down to the vagueness, really, of the international law, and then just doing what they wanted to do. And most of them had a vested interest. They were sending aircrew home and receiving aircraft in return. In the example of Portugal, who are Britain's oldest ally, we said to them, look, if you send our guys back, you can keep their aircraft. So, an aircraft that come down with, let's say, a fuel leak or engine trouble in Portugal, the Portuguese just repainted it in Portuguese markings, fixed it and kept it. And in the case of Sweden and also Turkey, they were receiving commodities such as oil and rubber, and also aircraft, tanks, etc., as a thank you for sending our guys home on repatriation. So, even though it strictly wasn't allowed under international law, everybody did it anyway.
That's just so interesting. One question I have for you, Andrew, was, did any British airmen attempt to escape from internment in neutral countries? And how were those escapes viewed at the time, both in the country that they were escaping from and sort of in the UK?
Yes, they did, and there was a government missive that said, just as POWs, you are expected to attempt to escape where possible from internment, and guys did. There was actually a kind of a mini Great Escape, if you like, from a camp called Lagouhat, which was a Vichy French one in North Africa. It was in Algiers. And it was in the Sahara. It was an old French Foreign Legion fort, so, think Beaugest and all of that. And our guys dug a tunnel out and got out of the camp into the Sahara. And the account I read said, we all knew that we were not going to make it to freedom because we're in the middle of the Sahara. Where are you going to go? I can't carry as much water as I need. I haven't got as much food as I need. But it gave them something to do. Rather than just sitting there swatting flies all day and getting dysentery, they decided to dig a tunnel for something to do. I think 29 of them got out, but they were all recaptured within 24 hours. And the punishment, again, was horrific. Solitary confinement in spaces far too small for them, denial of food, denial of water, exercise, and the opportunities to shower or whatever. And again, that account said it wasn't as bad as the Black Hole of Calcutta because we didn't die, but there were times during the night when we wished we had. And this is supposedly in a neutral country. I'll give you a couple more examples. There's a wonderful one that I like from Ireland, and 11 British aircrew managed to escape from Ireland from internment, mainly because it was fairly easy to do. It's a very permeable border with Northern Ireland, and it was fairly easy to cross. Plus, you've got a whole load of Brit expats living in Ireland who are willing to help you. You speak the same language. It's fairly easy to blend in, that sort of thing. But there was a case of an American pilot who was flying with the RAF. His name was Roland Wolf, and he crossed the US border into Canada in 1940 before America joins in to volunteer. So he finds himself as an RAF Spitfire pilot doing a convoy patrol over the Atlantic, and his Spit develops engine trouble. So he turns around and thinks, I've got to land this as quickly as I can. He sees land and he goes down. Unfortunately, he's come down in County Kerry in the Republic, and he hasn't made it across into Northern Ireland. So he's taken as an internee. Now, as I mentioned, Ireland had a very sort of lax attitude towards parole. And Wolf came up with a scheme where he was ostensibly leaving the camp to go off to the pub or the cinema or whatever. And he arrived at the main gate of the camp and he signed himself out on parole. And he then made a big song and dance of patting all his pockets in front of the Irish Army Guard at the gate. And he said, "Oh, look, I've forgotten my wallet. Do you mind if I go back and get it?" "Yeah, no, off you go." So Wolf goes back. He surreptitiously signs himself back in, so now not on parole, and then grabs his wallet, goes back to the main gate and says, "Got it, see you later," and walks out. Now, in his mind, he was not on parole because he signed himself back in. He goes to Dublin, he catches a train to Belfast, and he's now back in the United Kingdom. Now, this caused a massive diplomatic row because parole has its roots in the model of chivalry, and it's a gentleman's unbreakable bond, and you were a pariah if you broke parole, even amongst your own side, if you broke your word. So the British ambassador in Ireland spoke to his Irish counterpart in the Irish government, and he also spoke to the US ambassador in Ireland as well. And between them, they agreed that this really wasn't on, old boy. It may be technically legal, but in the spirit of parole, we don't think you should have done this. So the unfortunate Wolf, having escaped, was sent back to Ireland and did 2 more years in internment.
Oh, gosh.
And then I'll just give you the case of British internees in Switzerland. Now, as I mentioned earlier, internment in Switzerland was very benign, living in hotels, going skiing, and all of the good stuff. However, bar the Vichy French, the Swiss had the most stringent punishment for internees for trying to escape. And several British aircrew were held in a prison that's called Val-Villemouse. And an American who was held there, he wrote 2 books about his time in Val-Villemouse prison. And the prison was run by a very pro-Nazi Swiss camp commandant. The conditions were horrific. They were every bit as bad as they were in the Vichy French prisons. They were beaten, they were starved, there was TB that was rife. And the American guy who wrote the book was also raped several times by the guards and also inmates, specifically Russians and Eastern Europeans. He complained to the camp commandant, who just dismissed it with a wave of his hands. So bizarrely, the Swiss, being the custodians of the Geneva Convention and the Red Cross, handed out arguably the worst punishment that you could suffer for the crime of trying to escape. The Americans tried to bring war crimes indictments against the camp commandant at the end of the war, but they couldn't do it because Switzerland was a neutral country, so they hadn't committed a war crime. But the treatment was horrific in that prison.
I remember that being, I think, in Don Miller's Masters of the Air. I think,
it's Don Miller who, yes, that's right.
Yeah, and when the TV series came around, I did wonder if they were going to cover that, and they didn't. Yeah. But yeah, the next question, I guess, is a little bit of an awkward one, but is there any evidence to suggest that some airmen might have deliberately entered neutral territory as a way of avoiding further combat?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. There is no firm evidence. What there is rumour. And I interviewed 2 Bomber Command veterans, Colin Bell and George Dunn, about this. And they both said, we heard rumours that crews were deliberately diverting to Switzerland and Sweden in particular because you have a cushy life and you've done your bit, so we'll go and sit out the rest of the war. But there is no firm evidence. And I think it would have been fairly hard to prove because, if you're a pilot, you're on your way back from Berlin, you've been hit, you don't know whether you're going to make it back home or not. You decide to go into Sweden. And lo and behold, it turns out your aircraft was perhaps perfectly capable of making it home. Well, you didn't know that at the time. So that would have been hard to prove. Equally, I think if a pilot wanted to go to a neutral country, could have done by saying, I didn't think my aircraft was going to make it. Again, that would have been very hard to prove. Also, the majority of aircraft that went into places like Sweden and Switzerland certainly were bombers. So they were multi-crew. And you would have had to have the agreement of all 7, let's say in the case of a heavy, or both of you in a Mosquito, to say, yes, let's go in. All it takes is for one of those guys to say, no, I don't want to do that, or I didn't want to do that. And once they get into Sweden, you're interviewed by the air attaché from Stockholm, and he finds out that actually the crew went there deliberately. And one of them has said, no, I didn't want to go. I was all for going back home and continuing the fight. There was debate in Parliament at the end of the war about how RAF absconders were going to be treated. And in all of the cases of those who were listed in that debate, none of them were internees. So I think it's very unlikely that people went into internment on purpose, but it was certainly a good rumour at the time, as George and Colin Bell both said so. But I've seen nothing to disprove that it was just a rumour.
Wow.
God, this is absolutely fascinating.
Brilliant,
This has taken me back to when I studied international law when I was at university. As part of my law degree, it was actually the only bit of my law course that I actually enjoyed. It's all sort of stuff like this about neutrality and about the laws of war and all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
I mean, there is another difficulty there as well. I mean, if after the war you had tried to bring military charges against anybody for deliberately going into internment, what charge do you actually bring against them? You can't bring desertion, because desertion has a clause in it that says you permanently intended to go. You were never coming back. Most of them were repatriated. So that would have been, and it would have been easy for them to say, no, look, I want to go back after the war. I'm not here permanently. So desertion was out. So the only other one I think you could have levelled was cowardice. And cowardice obviously has the clause in the face of the enemy.
Yeah.
Well, you were in the face of the enemy when you were over Berlin, but you're not now that you're over Stockholm. So it's not really cowardice either. So I think it would have just been all too difficult to have brought charges against them. But again, as I say, there's no real evidence to say that anyone did it deliberately anyway.
Wow. This has just been absolutely fascinating. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion on a very overlooked aspect of the air war, I think, and you've helped bring out both the human stories and also the wider legal and political complexities of the time as well. So thank you so much for that. We've really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I'm sure our listeners will enjoy it too.
Yeah, really enjoyed that. I learned a lot as well, so thank you. That does bring us to the end of the episode and indeed the series 4, never mind the Dam Busters. If you've enjoyed the series, one of the best ways you can support us is by leaving a rating or review on your favourite podcast app. It really does help others discover the show. If you'd like to go a step further, you can support the podcast for as little as £2.40 or $3 a month, helping us cover hosting and production costs. You'll find all the details in the show notes. We'd also love to hear from you, so do join the discussion in our Facebook group or connect with us across social media. We'll be taking a short break, but we'll be back with Series 5 later on in the year with more stories, guests and fresh perspectives on the air war.
Yes, we've already got some great guests and intriguing stories lined up for you. I am absolutely ready for a rest, and I think you are as well, James.
Yeah, a lot of writing to do.
It's a huge amount. I mean, we both do absolutely love doing the podcast, but it is an enormous amount of work, especially when we both have sort of full-time commitments as well. So yeah, we're having a much-earned break, but we will be back later with some more fantastic stuff for you. So until then, thank you so much for listening, everyone. We really do massively appreciate your support. Take care and goodbye. We'll see you later on. Bye.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.